that's going on and all the troubling of the post that's already happening in this space, which is what the space was created to be. So I'm just thrilled to be here, and thank you to the students as well for all the work that you've done in organizing such a beautiful ICER. I'm going to talk today about what we really mean when we talk about a post world, or when we use the signifier post. And I'm going to kind of take some quiet conversations that I think a lot of us are having, maybe behind closed doors or with each other, or kind of wondering and asking, what do we really mean by post? I think that's a question that a lot of us often ask. What does it all mean? That I've been asked by others who are here and attending and maybe less familiar with post theories, who are asking, what does post really mean? So that's the question and the tension that I'm going to be addressing today. And thank you to Kyung Mi for the invitation to actually be able to have the space to do that kind of work. So I just want to start by saying that a lot of us find ourselves in an experience of a profound disorientation, or something like a sense that the frameworks and theories that we once found generative or useful don't quite respond to the moment that we're in, don't quite address the complexity of the poly crisis or all of these wicked problems we're facing, both regionally, locally, and globally, perhaps looking for new ways to understand or illuminate the complexity of these issues. And so as we were asked to reflect in many of the opening remarks, such as what kind of knowledge, human ontology, and evolution and responsibility does education now require, by Director O. Also, SNU President Ryu told us that an era shaped by AI, digital transformation, climate change, and facing demographic shifts and growing social inequalities and challenges demand more than just new technologies or better solutions. They challenge us to rethink and ask new questions about education, knowledge, and our shared future. And so post theories give us the opportunity to do this. They have a hand in helping us make sense of the messiness that we now experience, the entanglements we face, while also the freedom to let go of some of the conceptual and analytical framings that perhaps no longer serve us in the same way, or that don't seem to fit the current moment. Okay, there we go. Herman Paul, in his introduction to this book on post everything, talks about all post concepts are positioning concepts with relational meanings. So not all posts mean the same thing, right? But posts are all signifiers of some kind of relationship with something that came before. And so I think that's important to think about post concepts themselves as relational. And I couldn't begin to tell you or explain all of these post concepts, so please don't ask me. But I can talk about some of them. But you might be more familiar with some than others, but just to keep in mind that not all posts mean the same thing, right? And post theories can be very generative, and you see the proliferation of post theorizing in our current moment. They offer us a way to, borrowing from Donna Haraway, feminist science studies scholar, stay with the trouble of this disorientation that we're experiencing. Rhizomatic, entangled relationships, assemblages of bodies, actions, discourse, materiality, affect, all of these things always in motion, replace linear cause and effect relationships and approaches that in some ways fallen short of their ability to truly describe the complex conditions of society, life, classrooms, etc., and learning. So this is less about explaining the world than attending to it or responding to it differently. And it's also sometimes a shift from asking what is to asking what if. Again, from the welcoming remarks, we were asked to reconsider existing assumptions, that the post-world defies any singular interpretation, calling for diverse perspectives and methodological pluralism in education research, which can be very productive. We were also asked to think about how can education research continue to generate meaningful knowledge in times of uncertainty. And post theories have brought some creativity and innovation that I think is much needed in this space. The paradox here is that, as I said before, post doesn't always mean beyond, but it does signal a desire, a need for something else, something different, something otherwise. However, I think it's important to take a moment and always think about what limitations do the affordances of post-theoretical innovations bring, and vice versa. So a key question I want to pose in the talk is, what work are post theories doing and for whom? At the same time, as academics, we do need the freedom to think without constantly justifying immediate usefulness or translation to practice. It's important to have that time to reflect deeply. And sometimes the actionable dimensions of our theories take time to surface and time to think and reflect. But this matters especially for education scholars, and it's a tension that has surfaced with other education scholars in conversations I've had over the past several years, that some of this post-thinking comes across as disconnected or obscure at a time when there's growing resentment worldwide toward academics as out-of-touch elites. That obscurity is something that we need to address together, and that's part of what we're doing here at this conference, I think. So this disconnection can push us further from the very realities and the very people that our theories claim to be about. As one example, I recently saw a presentation describing a government-funded project, and it was not here, by the way. I'm not gonna say where it was, but it wasn't here, okay? So don't start looking and pointing fingers at each other, please. I saw a presentation describing a government-funded project based in post-humanist approaches that brought together activists, scientists, artists, and local policymakers. It was very well-intentioned and also very well-resourced. The research brought various participants together for a series of vegan dinners, during which participants co-constructed activists using an arts-based approach, such as listening, and these were emergent activities that came up through the interaction of participants, such as listening to a potato through a stethoscope, and role-playing with food items, such as imagining a goji berry as a worm's heart. Several similar collective and sensory art science activities, or soft activism as the researcher described them, emerged between the participants through these food-based activities. So I confess, when I was listening to the work, I wasn't entirely sure what the point was, but I'm not sure the point was meant to be legible in that way. And I don't say this to mock the work. I say it because it captures something real about where post-thinking can end up, however earnest, however well-funded, yet almost entirely illegible to anyone outside the room or outside the people who were there. So on the way to this same conference, I have to point out there were dozens of houseless people begging for food in the street. The idea of spending thousands of dollars of public funds on post-human playing with food was, in that moment for me, unsettling. So, okay. So some of the work that I've been doing has been looking at this idea of unforgetting. And again, Paul, one of the authors of the Post-Everything book, says, instead of treating the emergence of post terms as indicative of a major shift in Western societies, we are curious to find out what these terms reveal about people's relations to the past or regimes of historicity, their experience of change, as well as their sense of continuity and their negotiation of distance and proximity. So as I mentioned before, these post concepts are always in relation to something that came before. But what does it mean to be post in a time of reactionary political movements? Academics such as literary scholar and fellow Monash University colleague Claire Colebrook have called this time period the Trumpocene, a period characterized by willful forgetting in Trump's America, but also around the world. We've seen the simultaneous rise of fascism globally by the erasure or willful ignorance of the histories of exploitation that produced our current ecological crisis, including the extractivist nature of technologies such as AI and LLMs that are often so uncritically adopted in education, technologies which require the expansion of extraction from the periphery, often referred to as the global south, to the core or the global north, the minority world, the majority world to the minority world. So I've written in this piece on the Trumpocene, unlike the Anthropocene, which positions humanity as a unified geological agent, the term Trumpocene, like Jason Moore's The Capitalist Scene, draws attention to how environmental destruction is linked to social and economic oppression. These interlocking systems of oppression thrive on historical amnesias. In the Trumpocene, power lies partly in political leaders' ability to make us or embolden us to forget, to erase histories of slavery, colonialism, and exploitation of labor that made our current ecological crisis possible. And as Colebrook notes, this brand of forgetting creates fertile ground for populist appeals that promise simple solutions while avoiding difficult truths. Reactionary politics thrives on this kind of forgetting and ignorance of the barbarism that got us here. Against this, ecofeminist and environmental education scholar Annette Go calls on her field, environmental education, to practice unforgetting, to revisit and remember the theories, scholarship, and activism that have helped us mobilize through challenging geopolitical times throughout history. She cautions against discarding or writing off the old ways. She argues, for example, that much of, and this is a direct quote from her, much of what is being conceptualized in feminist new materialism, and I would add, or post-humanist feminism, was also being recognized in ecofeminist writings of the 1990s. This needs to be acknowledged by environmental educators. As Go points out, a key and often overlooked contribution of ecofeminism is the way it has always attended to nature, power, and materiality. Though critiqued by new materialist and post-humanist feminisms for its essentialist dimensions, ecofeminism has for decades offered a sophisticated analysis of how the exploitation of women and the exploitation of nature are entangled with capitalism, colonialism, and racism. And more important, it has demonstrated record of intervening in those political movements, building counter movements from below, such as seed saving, forest protection, and land defense. Unforgetting is a practice of bringing old and new together in the service of both critical depth and the actionable strategies we're often accused of lacking as academics. In my work with Indigenous communities, I've learned the importance of thinking carefully about theoretical innovation and also theoretical reclamation or epistemological reclamation, a point I'll discuss in more depth in some of the following slides. So as President Young Sung Ko reminded us, the essential purposes of education endure: human dignity, nurturing agency, enabling others to live responsibly. Education plays a key role. So this is an important consideration for us in the post-world. Okay, so Donna Haraway, who I mentioned before, feminist science studies scholar and a thinker central to post-humanist scholarship, she herself is actually careful about the post terms such as post-humanism and postmodernism. So people often refer to her as post-humanist, but she doesn't refer to herself as post-humanist. She also distinguishes post-human, which as a term, as a descriptor, which she rejects as fundamentally teleological and tied to fantasies of a final or transhumanist human trajectory off planet, right, from the scholarship of post-humanism. So she's more accepting of this term post-humanism. It's a term she respects, and the scholarship she respects, even if she isn't fully comfortable in claiming it herself. Her own preference, on the other hand, is for the term compost. So she plays a little bit with the word post and talks about compost, human as humus, entangled in the soil in multi-species life and death. It's a small refusal, she says, to be quite so serious about categories. So this compost is also a bit of a play, and to let these categories sit a bit lightly with the complexity of the world, all of these descriptors that we use. As feminist scholar Maria Puig de la Bellacasa has written, at the height of the hype surrounding Haraway's work in the 90s, she constantly puzzled attempts to class her as postmodern. So people like to refer to her as a postmodern feminist. And she said, and this is a direct quote from Haraway, "A lot of my heart lies in old-fashioned science for the people," which is an organization that has experienced a resurgence over the past 10 years, I'd say, that was very active in the 60s and 70s, essentially is a socialist organization that does a lot of community and radical science activism. So I want to slow down and stay with the trouble of the post, as Haraway has encouraged, particularly around issues of legibility, exclusivity, politics, and inequality. So I'm going to take you through a couple of examples and as case studies of post theories that have been more widespread in education. The first one is post-humanism. Snaza and colleagues who have been leading scholars in this area and education research have written, if for a very long time man has been the measure of all things, anthropocentrism, post-humanism is looking to account for things in a non-anthropocentric way. This new way of thinking, which is only new in the sense that it puts humans back into the thick ontological and political relations in which they have always already been networked, is going to necessitate wide-ranging and radical changes in how we conceive of educational practices and institutions. It goes, and Bredodi writes, post-human, who's also a leading post-humanist scholar, post-humanism is the historical moment that traces a different discursive framework, looking more affirmatively towards new alternatives. So we see this radical shift in thinking differently and thinking otherwise from the post-humanist perspective. Post-humanism has been one of the most influential recent post-movements in education research. Snaza and colleagues argue that post-humanist thought require us to reconfigure how we understand politics and knowledge, reconfigurations that would sort of send shockwaves through educational research, by troubling the humanist concept through which virtually all educational thought has been articulated. For a very long time, man has been the measure of all things. Posthumanism attempts to explore non-anthropocentric pedagogies, assemblages, and so on, even asking the question, what might it mean to describe the world without situating everything in relation to humans at all? However, there are important questions to consider here. Firstly, even Braidotti acknowledges that there are many humanisms, and she's only engaging with one tradition, which is from the Enlightenment period, the liberal humanism. Secondly, is humanism the same thing as human exceptionalism? Or are we losing something valuable by rejecting humanism wholesale? Does becoming post-human actually undo the exclusions built into the humanist rational man? Or does it just reproduce them in a new vocabulary? What would it mean to think post-humanism with indigenous ontologies, such as expansive notions of personhood that emerge from a lot of indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, rather than centering Western philosophical traditions once again, traditions that, as Snaza and colleagues themselves admit, post-humanist curriculum theory still has to find ways of working outside of. Furthermore, this tension highlights other issues around unforgetting. In the early 1990s, ecofeminist scholar Val Plumwood offered a rigorous critique of human nature dualism, showing how dominant conceptions of reason were constructed by devaluing and feminizing nature, a category that conveniently swept in women, colonized people, and animals alike. This, in substance, a very similar point conceptually that posthumanism makes decades later with their critiques of anthropocentrism and flat ontologies, except that Plumwood foregrounds system of oppression in her analysis. Mikolino Zembalas in 2026, in a recent article, and he's written several this year as he does, has written, one risk, for example, is that post-humanist and new materialist approaches may universalize rationality without critically examining the colonial foundations that determine whose relations and whose lives are rendered visible or valuable within these assemblages, particularly through structures of anti-Blackness. And he goes on to write, as the field increasingly turns to post-humanist, new materialist, and decolonial frameworks, scholars view this moment as an opportunity to rethink the ontological premises of education, particularly how knowledge, agency, and value are distributed across human and non-human worlds. As several critics note, post-humanism's gestures towards inclusivity can paradoxically reinscribe Eurocentrism, appropriating non-Western cosmologies while failing to engage the colonial histories that rendered them marginal in the first place. For example, in comparative education, post-humanist work may draw on indigenous relational ontologies to critique anthropocentrism while bracketing the colonial histories of schooling and of ongoing dispossession that marginalize these knowledges and continue to do so. As Chapato and Chandler point out, and this is still Zembalas' quote here, post-humanism's move to decenter the human often overlooks the fact that for many populations, Black, indigenous, and colonized peoples, the struggle has never been to move beyond the human, but to be recognized as fully human in the first place. From this perspective, the project of undoing human exceptionalism cannot proceed without reckoning with the histories of racialization and dehumanization that structure modernity itself. So I think that's a very important point there, and he does draw, I should say, from a lot of Sylvia Wynter's work on this subject. In addition, I think we have to think about the increasing prevalence of AI, and that resurfaces questions about humanity. So as Zakjo has recently written in 2026, while the development of agential machines might seem to validate post-human critiques and ontologies, they have also necessitated a humanist response. This is because the socio-technical transformations of AI are accompanied by discourses that devalue what it means to be human and have consequences that increasingly marginalize human agency, corrupt human knowledge, threaten human interests, and are experienced as dehumanizing, and I would add exploit human labor from the periphery to the core and resources. He argues for a humanist stance to address some of these threats and issues in the age of AI. So the material stakes of this debate are not abstract. We're in an area of AI systems raising questions of machine personhood and transhumanist futures at the very moment the humanities, the disciplines historically tasked with asking what makes us human in the first place, are being defunded, underrepresented, including defunding to things like art education in public schools, losing space, time in the curriculum, and losing resources. So we need to keep that front and center. So a second case study I'll share is around post-critical theory in education and post-criticalist stances. Schildermans et al. In a special issue on post-critical stance in education in 2024 write, what the post-critical stance entails in terms of doing research is still something to be found out and philosophically conceptualized. So it's kind of similarly characterizing this field as open-ended, very exploratory, still trying to figure out what we're all about, right? Post-critical scholarship in education, as Schildermans et al. Write, responds to a real frustration that critique, understood as debunking or denunciation, has become the only imaginable stance in critical educational research. So their response is to combine denunciation with enunciation, and that's a more affirmative, constructive orientation to education, holding on to what is good, valuable, possible, etc. This is a generative move, but it isn't necessarily new or a substantive departure from the old. Theories from the Global South, for example, Paulo Freire's notion of praxis, reflection, and action, critical pedagogy, undertaken together in the service of liberation, was never just about critique. It was always about both diagnosis and transformation. And Black and Third World feminist thought has long modeled exactly this fusion as well. For example, bell hooks engaged pedagogy insists that rigorous critique of oppressive structures goes hand in hand with a commitment to love, hope, transformative practice, and imagining otherwise, and that these are not in tension. So here it's also necessary to engage in practices of unforgetting. When we ask who gets credited with moving beyond critique towards something affirmative and transformative, it's worth asking who was already there. Critical pedagogy and Black feminist thought weren't waiting for a post-critical turn to tell them that critique and transformation belong together as part of emancipatory education. Post-critique has also been criticized for its perceived alignment with neoliberal ideology. For example, John 2022 writes, political and social pressures have transformed significant parts of critical theory into post-critical handmaidens and apologetics for neoliberal subjectivity, blaming the victims of the commodification of knowledge production while ignoring the political and economic perpetrators that actively pursue those policies and actually benefit from the absence of systemic alternatives or from the spread of competition. There's nothing critical about this way of thinking, and therein lie the political implications of large part of post-critique. So furthermore, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Rockhill. When we move our attention from direct and focused critique of inequality produced by the state or produced by the techno-fascists, for example, or the techno-imperialists, we run the risk of what Rockhill describes as, quote, creating an intellectual environment in which imperial projects could be pursued unhindered by serious critical scrutiny from the intelligentsia, from academics. The recently released research paper from 1985 entitled France, Defection of the Leftist Intellectuals examines, and this is still Rockhill's work, and undoubtedly in order to manipulate the French intelligentsia and its fundamental role in shaping the trends that generate political policy. So Rockhill asks, what lessons might we draw from this report, particularly in the current political environment with its ongoing assault on the critical intelligentsia in academia? First of all, it should be a cogent reminder that if some presume that intellectuals are powerless and that our political orientations do not matter, the organization that has been one of the most potent power brokers in the contemporary world internationally does not agree. The US Central Intelligence Agency, as its name ironically suggests, believes in the power of intelligence and theory, and we should take this very seriously. Rockhill also goes on to say that in falsely presuming that intellectual work has little or no traction in the real world, we not only misrepresent the practical implications of theoretical labor, but we also run the risk of dangerously turning a blind eye to the political projects for which we can easily become the unwitting cultural ambassadors. Although it is certainly the case that the French nation-state and cultural apparatus provide a much more significant public platform for intellectuals than is to be found in many other countries, the CIA's preoccupation with mapping and manipulating theoretical and cultural production elsewhere should serve as a wake-up call to us all. So what they were really interested in, the CIA apparently, was post-structuralism, because they found it actually to be a politically productive move away from leftist critique of state power And so they supported this move towards post-structuralism, and there's some evidence that they even tried to kind of foment this critique to move people away from direct critiques of the state. So I just want to take some time to also think about what draws us to post theories beyond just the theory itself. And I think some of it is the community, and I think that's really valid to think about. A lot of the intellectual spaces that we're drawn to are partly because we're interested in the community of scholars and the people who are there and the ideas, and that's why we were drawn to them. But when we form communities, we also have to ask ourselves who's in the room and who is not, and what are those intentional and unintentional exclusions, and to just be transparent and to reflect on those cuts in a way. And then also to think about how might we build solidarity across difference in an unequal world. So I find, again, Maria Puig de la Bellaicasa's work very useful in this space, where she talks about this notion of thinking with care and how we might embrace a practice of thinking with care, which she positions as a doing in our work. So we need time to slow down and think together, and as the dean of the SNU College of Education pointed out, to have time for dialogue and genuine connections, which is what we're doing here. And I think it's really nice to see that we are thinking across some disciplinary boundaries in this space and doing that work together, and so talking to people who have different methodological traditions, different disciplinary traditions, and I think that's really generative and really valuable. So how do we think across academic and disciplinary and institutional divides? Thinking with others is itself an act of building communities. Thinking with in order to make a difference, but also how do we think about bringing unexpected others into our theorizing, into our collective thinking? And Puig de la Bellacasa writes, Haraway's thinking with creates new patterns out of previous multiplicities, and she uses Haraway's work as a model of how we can do this kind of practice. So she says, Haraway intervenes by adding layers of meaning rather than questioning or conforming to ready-made categories. The way in which Haraway enacts this thinking with has led her to hold multiple ends of supposedly clashing positions, messing up with pre-existing categories. So Haraway herself has written, for example, that a fair account of feminist discussions also involves cutting across these fixed theoretical divides. Like feminist theory often gets referred to as a fixed theoretical space, but it's very contentious and very diverse. And so Haraway has written that Hartstock, and these are all feminist scholars, Hartstock, Harding, Collins, Starr, Bhavnani, Singh, Haraway, Sandoval, Hooks, and Butler are not supposed to agree about postmodernism, standpoints, science, regards of their development, or of refusing rereading and overlaying in order to make new patterns from previous disputes. And so Maria Puig de la Bellacasa writes, when webs of thought share a history, there's a cost in dividing and opposing. Indeed, one can notice that readings of feminist thinking webs that we find in Haraway's writings tend to highlight and foster the efforts to care for each other rather than to settle into breaks and splits. And then the quote that I have on the slide, but if care is a doing, there is a practical feature of this form of caring. In Haraway's work, this commitment is written and embodied through her writing. It's written in pretty obviously through a lively politics of quotation. This way of writing gives credit for many of the ideas, notions, or affects nourishing her thinking to fellow researchers and students, but also to friends, human and non-human, affinity and activist groups, whether inside or outside academic or intellectual realms. And if you read her book, Staying with the Trouble, you can see how she does that in a couple of those chapters. So Puig de la Bellacasa writes, what is interesting to me here and what I find compelling in fostering a style of writing with is not who or what it aims to include and represent in a text, but what it generates. It actually creates collective. It populates a world. Instead of reinforcing the figure of a lone thinker, the voice in such a text seems to keep saying, I'm not the only one. So thinking with makes the work of thought stronger. It supports its singularity and contagious potential. I think something else that we might think about is acknowledging the limitations of our theoretical innovations, and I think this goes really nicely with the idea of thinking with care. For example, in the post-digital community, Florian Kramer, who actually was, I think, one of the people who first began to term this notion of post-digital, talked about how it's a term that sucks, but it's useful, right? So not, again, with the spirit of Haraway, not taking ourselves too seriously and acknowledging the limitations of our work and acknowledging that maybe the term that we're using isn't actually capturing everything we want it to capture. And even Petar Jandrić, who's the editor-in-chief of the Post-Digital Journal, says, yeah, we're using this term, but maybe we won't use it forever because it still kind of sucks, and maybe we'll find a new term eventually that will replace this. But for now, it makes sense to us, right? But even, I was just at the Post-Digital conference a couple of weeks ago, and we still have people asking, wait, what is post-digital? So even people who are at the conference. But I think that's okay to have the sense of humility. And my response, because it came up in one of my presentations, my response was, nobody really knows. We still don't know. We're still thinking about it together. But essentially, post-digital, again, in this case, isn't a move to the beyond. It's thinking about the fact that we can't separate the digital and the analog. We live in a world where the entanglement is the experience, right? Even if you wanted to completely separate yourself from the digital and go out and hiking and leave your phone, I mean, your world is still very much constituted within the digital, but also the analog. So both go hand in hand. So that's what that is, as far as we know. Right, Kyung-mi? So I think this idea is really important, though, having this sense of humility and maybe more of a playful attitude with this kind of work and with the terms we are using and with our theoretical affinity groups. So one of the things we're doing right now in Monash University is I'm co-director of science education in the Anthropocene Lab. And the goal of this lab is an impact lab. So the goal really is about social impact. In order to have a social impact, we believe strongly that we need to bring people together, again, in that idea of thinking with care with each other, people from groups who might not necessarily we always come in contact with beyond our own discipline, but beyond our own institution, bringing together a diverse collective of voices, including science educators from early childhood through tertiary, but also community activists and organizers, indigenous knowledge keepers, Aboriginal educators, environmental justice advocates, and think about how we might transform science education in this planetary crisis. So we don't necessarily have answers. We're creating space and building community. And what we're essentially trying to do is think like a movement and build a movement across difference from below. And so this is a conversation, and we've been having conversations with a variety of different people in different ways. And even the Anthropocene, the term itself is a conversation, right? Because even scientists don't agree about whether this is the Anthropocene. I mean, officially don't call it that, right? But even social scientists and philosophers are having conversations about, is this really the best term? Is it the Kahulocene? Is it the Capitalocene? Is it the Plantationocene? Is it the Anthropocene? So this is or Trumpocene, right? Conversation's still happening, and we think that's really generative, and that's important that we can bring people into this conversation. But also the more practically oriented conversations about how science education can respond responsibly to this moment and think about that together. And I think the idea here is building a movement so that when it does come time to affect policy change, or we have that opportunity, we have a group of people who have thought together from below and have built power as well as developed strong relationships in collective. So that's some of the work that we're trying to do to kind of model this thinking with and thinking across. And thinking across very diverse theoretical traditions as well, because we have people from a range of theoretical traditions, from post-theories and not post-theories, and people in the sciences from doing really positivist work, for example. So I want to just take a moment to highlight some of the staying with the trouble of the post-world that I've seen here so far at this conference. And it's been really great. I had a lovely day yesterday thinking with all of you and the ideas that you're bringing up. And I didn't have a chance to put everybody that I saw up here. But I was really inspired by the work that I saw, and it really helped me raise some questions about my own work, which I think is what this kind of space should do, and the kind of thinking that we need for the post-world. In very generative ways. So we talked about this great paradox that Kyung-mi also mentioned, the notion of transformative collectivism, which is so powerful, but at the same time you have the tension of ongoing dubious access to education and the privatization and marketization of education. Learning and unlearning to be post-colonial, which Professor Kwok was a tension that she raised for us. This notion of epistemic unease, which I really appreciated, and also the notion of moving from private discomfort when something doesn't sit really well with us to shared theoretical insights around this notion of unease that we're experiencing, epistemic unease, and so making that more public and shared. And the idea of false subjectification, I think also being really careful from Professor Kwan about how we're subjectified, or even when we're thinking about critical subjectivities, how that plays out in real time and how that actually can be even recolonizing or imperialistic in a way. Students' responses to structural conditions, for example, how they respond to things like feeling that the job market is not for them anymore in the age of AI. So the notion of Tangping, lying flat, as not just a hopeless response, which it can be, but on the other hand, a sort of sense of collective agency and community building. And that was really valuable and made me think, how do our post theories engage with this kind of structural condition and the way that students are enacting collective agency, young people enacting collective agency to respond? And then looking at systemic intervention as a way to effect change after having experiences trying to work as educators. I think we often focus on the individual student, for example, but looking at systemic intervention as a more promising locus of change in our work. Designing events for encounter, I thought this was really generative as well. How do we think about our research as an event for encounter that helps us collectively address new problems with new materials and new research pedagogies in a way, new possibilities for thought? And then thinking about the rhetoric of crisis and the rhetoric of innovation and looking at the affective assemblages. This presentation was more about looking at policy, but I think this also applies to our own theoretical work, our own research, the rhetoric that we use around crisis, the rhetoric that we use around innovation, and taking a step back to maybe identify when we're doing that, why we're doing that, how we're doing that, what is our purpose, what is our intention, and what are our own affective assemblages, right, and our own theoretical affective commitments may be tied to our identities as academics. And largely, I felt like there was a lot of attention to nuance in the presentations and some questioning of our own positions, our assumptions, and our adoption of dominant and prevailing theories. So this was really generative. And I'll just leave you with some questions that we want to maybe ask ourselves or keep asking ourselves. How do theoretical innovations address current sociopolitical contexts, and particularly contexts of inequality in tangible ways? What are the affective dimensions of our attachments? Can we see the result of our own critique? And there was a response, another question from a participant in that session who asked, a postgraduate student, and I caught her name and I then didn't write it down, so I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but who asked, how can we have more reflexive and critical critique? And I thought that was a really generative question from the audience. What and who are we forgetting? Or I would say not always forgetting, even subsuming, where there's like a tokenistic inclusion of indigenous knowledge, for example, in our work in pursuit of theoretical novelty. To whom is our thinking legible and illegible, and why? So I think that's a really important question. This is not to say that our work always needs to be legible to everyone. Sometimes it's not, because sometimes we're speaking to a particular audience for a particular purpose. But I think as long as we're having those conversations with ourselves and with each other, that's what's really important. So that's why I say these are questions to keep asking ourselves. And then how might we think with care across difference to build solidarity and more robust forms of democracy? And I will just put some acknowledgments here, and I'm within time, so I feel super happy about this. I ran through this a couple of times, and I was 2 or 3 minutes over, but I'm right on time, so that never happens. That's amazing. So acknowledgments. I just want to say, in thinking with care, like I have all kinds of friends and colleagues, and I couldn't put them on here. People inside and outside of academia that I want to attribute to some of this thinking, who I've shared these ideas with, talked these ideas through with, and so these are some of them. And also, my dog, I talk to my dog a lot. Do you? Like, of course we talk to our pets about our ideas and our theories, and she listens so intently, you know? So I feel like if I can communicate something like this to her, then, you know, we must be doing something right. You can see her listening intently in the, at the top. The second one, she's getting a treat, so that doesn't count, right? That's why she's smiling. And then my family, this is my family. My husband's from Singapore, but this is a Korean photo booth in Melbourne, and I'm not sure the translation of the Korean is. I hope it doesn't say anything bad. My husband's always making fun of people who get Chinese tattoos, and he's like, they should have looked that up before they got that tattoo. And then trains. I spent a lot of time on trains before I came here, and just being on the train was, I think, really helpful for my thinking as well, and acknowledging all these objects and people in my life and references, a lot of them. And then just thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much. There's so much to take in. Oh, that's beautiful. I'm sorry that machine got broken. So I hope that everyone was kind of following enough, at least you can kind of feel it, right? Like with the Sarah's like nonstop like intellectual mumble, which I enjoyed a lot. So let's have another round of applause to her. Thank you very much. So while Sarah is taking a little bit of break, we can probably formulate interesting questions for Sarah to ask and say more. I can already see the hand. That's a good sign. Yes. Can you give the microphone to the audience over there? No. I was looking at the lady behind. I'm sorry. And then we can come to you.
Thank you. I was hoping you would share. Yeah.
My name is Nadia. And yeah, the question I had was about, and sorry for my voice, I caught a cold this morning. But anyway, I really like that the point you noted about, actually this turn is related to the use of public, and while we were using the font toward this reflexive and post-world turn, actually we are contributing to the defunding, and at the same time this funding is used to the project that is sometimes eligible to the people outside of the room. So one thing I noticed about this poster is that it also has very much emphasis on like processual approach to like emphasis on dialogue and making space for connection. I think this comes from the reflection from the emphasis on the goals, preset goals that excludes people and also forecloses the possibility beyond the preset ideas. But at the same time, I think the goals, learning goals, or target, or like SDGs, at the same time can contribute to like disseminate and distribute resources to people outside of the room. So I feel like there's also tension is this kind of emphasis on process itself. So I was wondering how you think about this tension between process and preset goal.
Yeah, I mean, there's always tensions in our work, and I guess I think that it's important to surface those tensions and discuss them with accountability partners, and they can't all be resolved. And I do want to say, I mean, the post-digital community, for example, is one of the most welcoming theoretical communities that I've ever experienced, because there is such an openness about, we can all think together because we're still trying to figure out this space and how we work in it together. And it's very transdisciplinary, even anti-disciplinary, I guess. So I do want to honor some of the work that's going on there. And I also think there's a tension, even in my own commentary, around we need to protect the space for humanities funding. And so some of the work that's being awarded funding in the humanities, I worry that my critique would then be interpreted to say, well, we should only fund the hard sciences because it's much more straightforward, right? And so some of the work in the humanities is very ambiguous and is somewhat unintelligible to people outside those disciplines. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't fund that work. I'm just thinking, out loud about how we might ask ourselves the difficult questions. I find that for me, that idea of process and theory and all of the messiness around it surfaces a lot in my work because I've worked a lot with indigenous communities, and as a white woman from North America and a settler colonial in most of the societies in which I've lived, there's always a tension of how I do this work and who I'm invited to do it by and what that means. And so thinking on multiple layers and macro and micro in terms of process. But there are ways to kind of think through it. For example, in New Zealand, in the work that I've done with Māori communities, there's always tikanga, which like a locally situated cultural protocol for how we make things right for that particular space or that particular project or that particular exchange of ideas or partnership. So that's what I've kind of relied on. And then I have accountability partners in that space who I can turn to and say, should I even be here, or should we even do this? And I think part of it is starting with the should we questions. You know, should we do this? And if we should, and who are we asking when we ask the question, should we? Not just ourselves, right? Should I do this? Yes. Or not just our dogs, because our dogs always love us, and they'll say, yeah, of course you should, as long as you don't leave me alone, right? So yeah, I think it's starting with the should we questions and then moving from there and making sure we're asking the right people about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. Thank you. So shall we take another question,
Yeah.
if that's okay? It's a gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Thank you, Madam the Moderator, for giving me the floor. And equally want to thank Professor Sarah for that brilliant and insightful presentation. What caught my attention on your keynote presentation, it's how you encourage researchers to critically examine how historical events, global issues, pandemic, wars have helped to continue to shape the education or educational system we have today. My question is focused on how can educational researchers balance learning from historical injustice while designing innovative and equitable education systems that meet the needs of today's rapidly changing world.
I mean, I think that's a lovely question and a really important one. And it's one I think about all the time. I think it's the question that actually is the reason why I'm in this field. It's the reason why I left classroom teaching to become an education scholar, is because I felt like I had bigger questions than the ones I could answer in my work as a classroom teacher, about how we can, through education, address some of these systemic inequalities and some of the big problems. And for me, I guess that in my own disciplinary area, it's intervening in science education. In the work that I do, I try to work at the policy level as well as the classroom level. So part of my commitment is always to work with educators on the ground so that I don't get too stuck in my ivory tower. So that's one kind of ethical principle that I live by in my work, which is to make sure that I always have teacher partners and that I spend a lot of time in schools and classrooms. And particularly, I think, the more underserved schools and classrooms, so that I kind of have a sense of the realities that both teachers and students and communities are facing. And then I can theorize from that space, as opposed to theorizing from my comfy armchair, right? With my dog on the couch. I do some of that, I'm not gonna lie. So yeah, I think that's first and foremost. Second of all, I really feel like we have to bring our work, we have to connect our work. And as individual researchers, we can make a difference. I truly believe that each of us has agency, and we have to enact whatever justice-oriented agency that we have. And I have different kind of agencies, say, than classroom teachers do necessarily sometimes. So they have particular kind of agency, but sometimes I have opportunities to speak in a different way to a different audience, and that's really important, or to school leaders who they might not be able to speak to in the same way. So I think we all kind of do our part, but then the unions are really strong in their ability to come together and affect change as well. So I do some work with teacher unions also in partnership. But I think it's building collectives. So a lot of my work has been about building collectives little by little. Some of that has been, again, from the ground up. So when I was working with teachers on an empowerment project, and the framework was on youth empowerment and looking at how science education can be a place for youth empowerment socially, academically, and politically. I started working with one teacher, and then that teacher and I started working with another researcher and her teacher partner in a completely different region of the country, and we would meet online to talk about what they were doing, and the teachers would lead the discussion, and we'd support. And then that group grew from 2 teachers to 12 over the period of a couple of years. And so it's kind of like these little pockets of hope, right, of transformation. And then they all do their own work of community building in their region. So someone said to me one time at a conference, we all need to think like a movement, and that was Siddharth Barath, who was a graduate student at the time from India, and he said this at a Science Educators for Diversity and Social Justice conference in 2018, encouraged us all to think like a movement, and that really stuck with me, so I've taken that into a lot of aspects of my work. So bringing collectives together, working with collectives, not trying to reinvent the wheel, working with local community organizations, teacher unions, and other kinds of, and doing curriculum policy work as well. It's been a big part of my work, yeah. Thank you for your question, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and answer. I think we have 30 seconds. So how can we stay with contradiction without feeling so frustrated? Can you just answer it with one sentence, please?
How do we stay with contradiction without feeling so... I guess I like to write through it. And I'll say real quickly, when I first started as an early career scholar, I think I shared this story the other night, I worked at University of Arizona, and one of my colleagues was Julio Camarota, who's done a lot of work in youth participatory research, and I was starting my own participatory research project, and it was very messy, and I'm like, why aren't the students empowered? What's happening? We're doing all this critical work, and they're not empowered yet. So it was very messy, and there were all kinds of contradictions that I faced, and my dean was like, where are you going to publish this work? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a publishable kind of research to me. So I was dealing with multiple layers of contradictions, and Julio said to me, yeah, that sounds about right. He's like, that's the process, that's just how it goes. It takes time, and you have to build the relationships, and you'll get there, but it's very messy along the way. And I thought, why is nobody writing about the messiness? So I try to surface the contradictions and try to address the messiness and try to write about those things as well.
Thank you. Beautiful. So we can all write, but before that, we may want to have lunch. So our lunch announcement will be given by one of the staff members, but let's just make a big fuss out of this great presentation and sincere answer. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have some announcements, so it's lunchtime now. For poster, and during lunchtime, there's also poster presentations. So 60 poster presentations